Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In this video I'll be continuing my build of my 3D printed T-34 by experimenting with some Armour texturing, trying out some AK Interactive Soviet greens, and preparing the model for some weathering. So without further ado, let's get into this one. Cleaning up resin models is something I've wanted to learn and practice more, especially when it comes to getting rid of print lines. So for this build, I would experiment for the first time with using a brush to apply some Mr. Surfacer 500, which had been thinned down with Mr. Hobby Leveling Thinner. I applied this first on the side skirts and the cannon barrel, the same as I would apply paint in smooth strokes, with the goal of using it to fill in some of the print lines and imperfections. I've also seen people use an airbrush to apply Mr. Surfacer as a primer that can also partially fill in small imperfections, which is something I'm keen to try on some aircraft kits in the future. For the armoured parts of the tank, I instead dabbed and stippled it on. Most World War II armoured vehicles, and especially Soviet ones, seem to have at least some roughness and imperfections, and my aim was to create some as well as to fill in the print lines and imperfections. Initially, I was afraid it would hide the surface details and be too strong, but I reckon I actually should have done a second coat of the stippling, as some of the print lines were still visible and none of the details were hidden. Though for a first attempt at this technique, I was still pretty impressed with the subtle texture it created and happy with the result. I gave the surface primer a few hours to fully cure before I then turned my attention to the gaps. I used some Vallejo water-based putty to fill them in, though not much was needed, and it was also in spots where the real T-34 would have had weld marks, which tend to be quite exaggerated, so I didn't have to do much to clean the putty up once it was applied. I also noticed some gaps on the hull, so I put the roof in place and applied some putty, even though I wouldn't be gluing the upper and lower hull parts together. I gave the putty 24 hours to fully cure before then using some white tack to mask off the interior and to attach all of the road wheels and the front parts of the idler and sprocket to a stick for priming. To prime the model, I mixed up 4 drops of acrylic flow improver with 12 drops of Vallejo's gloss black acrylic primer, and then sprayed this, building it up gradually on the wheels which had already received a coat previously, along with the turret and the hull. I continued to gradually build up layers of it until eventually all of these parts were a solid glossy black. I haven't done much experimenting with different colours of primer yet, but generally I'm finding I love black since it helps with artificial shadows and it's pretty easy to apply most colours over the top of. The primer was given 24 hours to cure before I would then move on to painting. For this build, I wanted to test some new greens I'd picked up, mainly AK Interactive's 4BO green. I mixed up a drop of Vallejo acrylic retardant to try and combat any tip drying, as well as 4 drops of AK Interactive's acrylic thinners with 8 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver and 10 drops of the AK paint. I began painting the sides of the lower hull first in case I didn't like the colour, but it looked really great to me, so I continued to then spray the rest of the hull along with the turret and wheels, gradually building the colour up in several thin coats until everything was a uniform green, except for the underside of the hull, which was left black to simulate some shadows. I often find AK acrylics are really hard to get the ratios right as they seem to vary between individual colours, but in this case I seem to have gotten the ratio just right as it sprayed on really easily with no tip drying at all. After a few light coats, I was pretty happy with the solid green, so I made up another mix of 3BO with the thinners, but this time added a few drops of Vallejo Model Air RLM yellow to create a lighter and more faded colour. This layer would add some highlights to the upper surface, simulating some light, as well as adding a subtle wear to the paint. I also applied it randomly in thick layers on some of the road wheels for a bit of variation, as though some of the wheels were more worn out and faded, or perhaps from a different production batch and the paint was slightly different. The effect was very subtle and ultimately it ended up getting hidden by the later weathering, so I may have been better off using white instead of yellow, but I didn't want the effect to be too saturated. The acrylics dry pretty quickly, so once I'd cleaned up my airbrush, I then used AK Interactive Dunkel Grau to paint the rubber rims on the road wheels. I didn't realise until after I'd finished this model, but I should have actually painted the edge of the idler wheels as well with the Dunkel Grau, since the early T-34s had rubber-trimmed idlers. While the first coat of Dunkel Grau dried, I decided to try some more extreme highlights as I've seen both Plasmo and Uncle Nightshift do on their armoured models. This was done by mixing some Vallejo Model Air Insignia White with Vallejo Model Air Ochre, which I'd also picked up as another colour to try for Soviet vehicles. I must admit this was the first time I've tried painting highlights like this, and I was very scared as it looked like I was ruining the model. But as it does for more professional model makers, fortunately these highlights would tone down a lot after varnishing and weathering. A second coat of Dunkelgrau was then applied onto the rubber of the road wheels, and once that was dry, I then used the ochre and white once more to dry brush the details on the road wheels and to carefully pick out the raised metal edge that separates the rubber. With the wheels now done, I was ready to seal the paint job in with some Vallejo acrylic varnish. I decided to go with some semi-gloss varnish since I've seen more professional armor model makers use this to achieve a subtle metallic effect. I may need to do a few more builds and different schemes on tanks before I can say if I'm a fan or not of this technique, as sometimes it looks a little bit strange to me, but in this case I thought it looked pretty decent on this model. The varnish was given 24 hours to fully cure before I would move on to weathering, which is what we'll be covering next time in part 3. Thank you very much for watching this slightly shorter than normal build video. I do hope you guys enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos. And feel free to leave any advice on how I or other model makers could improve in the comments below. A massive shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only the products I used to make this kit, but also the time I spent designing it and also making this video for it. All going to plan, I should have another video out towards the end of this weekend on building the Grumman Avenger from Hobby Boss, and I'll also be releasing part 3 where I cover weathering the T-34 sometime next week. That's it for now, but until the next video, as always, take care and model on.